welcome and thank you for making the time to come here. I know there's a whole lot of exciting political events happening. Everyone most probably are waiting to sort of the end of the day to hear what is coming out of the ANC's National Executive Committee. I just heard that Jacob Zuma is on a scheduled meeting left the ANC, a pre-scheduled meeting to see the Ugandan president. So one wonders whether people will use that opportunity to vote in his absence. Yeah. Welcome again to actually it's our fifth state of democracy debate. I mean, the idea really is, to take stock of our democracy, but also to take stock of democracy in the region and also in Africa. The previous ones focused mostly on South Africa, so we've expanded in. So, we've got three panelists. Unfortunately, one of our panelists is stuck at the airport, so Prof. John Tessa won't be here. He's the Executive Secretary for the Forum of Former African Heads of State and Government, but he will be here tomorrow because we have a civil society engagement tomorrow, and he will be here. So it's unfortunate, but his place will be taken by Tamuka Mamboa. Sorry if I got it wrong. Do you want to correct me? No? So, he's from Zimbabwe, and he's also a Democracy Work Associate, and he will take the place of Professor John Tessa. And then we've got Jules Uria, who is the chairperson of the SADC Council for Non-Governmental Organizations, and he joined us all the way from Seychelles. And it's very good to have him here. We were in a debate a couple of months ago in Swaziland with the SADC NGO Council. Now, just a little bit about Democracy Works, because we're doing this event in partnership with one of our partners, Liliesleaf. We've got a formal partnership, and we've got some exciting events next year, one including looking at liberation movements and the state of Africa's liberation movements, the current state and the future state, and so on. Now, a little bit about Democracy Works. Democracy Works was set up about 2 years ago as an initiative, a social democratic initiative in a South African context, to firstly, number one, if you look at South Africa and you look at other African countries, we've got wonderful constitutions, wonderful institutions, wonderful democratic laws, but, in terms of behavior, democratic behavior is often absent. So how does one build a democratic culture? How does one build, how do one create or foster democrats? So in a sense, most probably our country and many other African countries, democracy is often on paper, but we don't have individuals are not democratic. So how does one build a democratic culture? That's the first thing. And secondly, in terms, how does one empower citizens to be able to proactively, assert their rights? And then, of course, thirdly, in terms of democratic ideas, what is democracy in a developing country? What is democracy in an African country? In the context of ideas. If you think about it now, what we can talk about the last couple of years we've seen in Africa, for example, where, some African leaders argued, well, democracy is un-African, it is Western, it doesn't fit in Africa, and so on. And others would argue, look, if you look at what's happening with the Chinese development, they don't have democracy, why should we as Africans pursue democracy? And so on. And of course, and others have always argued that, well, democracy is inimical to African culture and those type of things. So how does one respond with a coherent democratic response to all Democrats across the continent, whether we're in civil society or we're in political party or we're as activists, and so on. And then, of course, also, how does one monitor democracy across the continent, and so on. So, broadly speaking, that's what Democracy Works is all about. We're working on tools to empower citizens, civil society, political parties, states, and so on, to foster quality, inclusive type of democracy. And also we are trying to rethink democracy in an African context. You know, what is the democracy we want? And then how do we achieve it? And what are the tools that we empower people to achieve democracy? Now, our Twitter handle is democracyw, and then our Twitter hashtag is State of Democracy SA, WFSOD, and then our Facebook, democracyworks.org.za. So please join us on our Facebook if you haven't done that. Engage with us on Twitter if you haven't done that before. And also, while you're here, join the hashtag State of Democracy SA. And, because we also live streaming this event and we want to get a debate going on the Twitter sphere. What I will do now is I'll bring my colleague from Liliesleaf, just to give you a little bit of a background of Liliesleaf. And then we open the debate. And the debate, I've forgotten to say, is going to be chaired by Tandwe Matthews, who's a Democracy Works Associate. She will facilitate the debate, and we'll try to have the debate really as a discussion and also as an interactive discussion.
Thank you, William. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Liliesleaf. Panelists, welcome. I think this discussion has come at a very opportune time. A very opportune time within the context of our liberation struggle, within the context of where the country is going, reflecting on what we have achieved over the last 22 years of our democracy. I think it's also very opportune and pertinent that this discussion is taking place here at Liliesleaf today. Why do I say that? I think one of the problems we are facing today is the realization that our liberation struggle history, and our history in general, is fading from our historical narrative. We're losing touch with what our struggle was all about. We're losing touch with the essence and meaning of that struggle, what the sacrifices were about, why they were struggling, what they were struggling for. William talked about what is democracy. That went to the core and essence of our liberation struggle, the ideas of a democratic society for all South Africans. Unfortunately, the reality today, that notion of a democratic society for all South Africans seems to be fading, seems to be dissipating along with our history. And I'd just also, within that context, like to just say a few words about how this came about. We started talking about it, 18 months ago, William? About the ideas. Why is it that liberation ideas, liberation politics, fails to get translated into government policy? Why does there seem to be a chasm between liberation ideas and government policy? Well, I think if we were to put our hands on our heart today, we would have to admit that we are failing. The ideas of our liberation struggle are not being translated into practical deliverables, policies, and implementation. We've seen that with the fees must fall. We've seen that with the service delivery boycotts and demonstrations. These are questions which we must ask ourselves. Why is it that we are failing to achieve these noble ideas which were articulated very much within the Freedom Charter? Where is our Freedom Charter today? Yes, it gets trotted out every now and then for what I'd like to call political expediency. But are we living up to the ideals of that document? Are we enacting that document? We hear people say we must return to the Freedom Charter. Why are we using that type of language? Why are we using language that we must return? We must bring it back. It should not have gone in the first place. It should have always been a guiding principle. If you listen to the words of people like Oliver Tambo, who said that the Freedom Charter went to the soul of the idea of being an African, and if we subscribed to the ideas of the Freedom Charter, we then were all African. Because he was trying to move away from the notion of color. He used the Freedom Charter to try and encapsulate the idea of a multiracial society for all South Africans. Governor Mbeki talked about the Freedom Charter as our moral compass. And I think these are very much pertinent questions around where we are today. And Liliesleaf is trying to...
So they decided to block the network, and it was not accessible until the official release of the results. Now, this is a concern for me.
Yeah, thank you. I would say, in which you have raised the issue of, say, is the nation state vanishing or is it retreating? I think it would be like a very bold assertion if you are to make that assertion that the nation state is vanishing, is retreating. But actually what we are seeing is a broadening of the sphere. That the nation state no longer has domination like it used to do in the past. There are also other competing, stakeholders coming in who have gained more power, mainly because of how technology has improved or compressed time and space. You begin to see that even while I'm here, I can be on the blog. Like I was looking at the past 2 days, where I was commenting on the events in Zimbabwe, where I did a blog article and another. But what I've seen is the amount of traffic that I've managed to generate with the articles that I've been doing. I've managed to engage with more than 10,000 Zimbabweans within a space of a week. Something which I could not do in the past. So this is where you see technology coming in. But it doesn't necessarily that when technology comes in, it replaces the politics. No, it doesn't. It's the politics, then the technology. It's a device. It's like icing on the cake. Thank you.
Sir?
Thank you. Just one comment and one question. Just on the last issue of the last speaker, my name's Oscar. I'm from the city of Johannesburg, so local government. And indeed, we have found, with the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, the theaters where it plays out it's accepted now that it is urban centers. It is the cities. And increasingly, whether you talk of environmental degradation, whether you talk of rapid immigration that gives pressures on utilities, etc., poverty and so forth, the theaters are your major metropole centers. And so there is a move where they are increasingly inviting cities to various international platforms. You would know that at the Habitat COP in Paris, they had a parallel structure with the cities because they are increasingly realizing that perhaps the nation state is not disappearing, but the more real experiences and the day-to-day dealings with these issues certainly happens at the city level. So that's just that comment. Then my question is, which is related to the first person. William, you spoke of multiple forms of democracy, and I think, knowing you, there's something that I think the panel is maybe not agreeing on, because indeed, the issue about, if we say that there is no one prescript for democracy, because indeed, capitalism has managed to hijack a particular notion of it and is trying to export it. And so when we talk of conservatism on the right and socialism on the other extreme to the left, how do we navigate through those in still talk of democracy? Because, ultimately the question perhaps is, are you suggesting socialism isn't democratic as a form of practice, government, and or administration? Thanks.
Okay, let me assume I'm William for now. But I think the question which you raise on the various types of democracy, what do we mean when we talk of democracy, I think it's a very valid question. Like I was actually reflecting on the death of Fidel Castro, and I've had huge heated arguments with many of my colleagues, particularly those who are on the left or who call themselves progressives, where they were extolling the life of Fidel. I mean, all they saw was a say in the matter. But beyond that, lived in the diaspora, has also given
based on people would argue, well, actually, it is Western, so we are not going to implement it. Or argue, look, it is our culture or African culture are supposedly not democratic and so on. So how do we get out of that, the abuse of either the two types of abuses we can get out of it? The first abuse is to say we can't implement democracy in African contracts because you know what, it doesn't fit us for whatever reason, or I'm African. That's the first thing. And the second abuse is how do we prevent people abusing actually democratic institutions? They say, well, our country is democratic. These are democratic. And then we use those institutions actually to be autocratic. And how do we also bring in ordinary Africans where they, we empower them and entrench their rights, their ability, to live in individual dignity, to get the public services they deserve, and to pay it equally, because that's also the other thing in the African context. People are not equal. You're either not equal because of social status, because of culture, because of religion. So how do we look at our democracy where everyone is equal? You're not going to enjoy because you're the president, you have different sets of laws. You have different sets of laws, but you still argue that you're in a democracy. How do we bring that, the equality under law in a country? So where, if you're the president, that you don't have bodyguards, just it's same as a person who lives who doesn't know, then we become equal. And I think then we actually start thinking really about what democracy is all about. I mean, the same, for example, if the president, do we all stand up and say you're honorary, or do we all stand up and say you're honorary for a poor person? If we do that for everybody, then now we start to talk. And I know it may seem silly on the one hand, but that's really how we have to think about democracy. And I think once we start thinking about that, we move away from the sort of, is it socialist on the one hand, is it Western on the other hand, and so on.
I totally agree. Just to add, for me, democracy is democracy, plain and simple. There's no African democracy. It's the application, as I've said, and democracy is in the hands of the people. But it is how we now actually take the power and change the system. You will have laws. You will have. I'm sure in South Africa you have good examples of how through the power of the people, through what the citizens have done, you've seen results. Today, if Zuma is facing his own party and about to be, I'm not sure, we are all waiting for the results. Even I'm waiting for that as a journalist, if he will be impeached or not. Well, it started somewhere, you understand? I was in Port Elizabeth observing for the last election. And as a journalist, I go out and I talk to a lot of people. And I was very impressed with a lot of young people, how they actually freely gave their views about the last elections. I know Port Elizabeth is a stronghold for the opposition, for the DA, but it was interesting how they share their views. And, this is where I think we are moving forward. It is us as citizens, but the problem is, as I've said, we are not well organized. You're right in saying if the president walks in, I'm sure everybody will just stand up. This is just a mentality. We've not been taught to do that, but it is just culture. This is why at the beginning I said that we diluted democracy with so many other elements, and we need to go back and relook at democracy, but I believe in one democracy. And it is the power of the people, and it is for the betterment, it is inclusive.
Thank you, William. You'll go with you.
Hello, my name is Sigrid. I'm a master's student at the University of Pretoria, but I'm originally from Norway. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I have 2 points I want to raise. First, I wanted to say it's very interesting for me coming from Norway and sitting in this and listening to you now, and I feel that the Scandinavian countries and Norway is generally regarded as having a very good, well-functioning democracy, social democracy, but we're also feeling, the trends of the world, and we're having a rise of right-wing populists in our country. The inequality is growing and so on. And I very much disagree with you that democracy is democracy, because I see, first of all, I believe that the word is kind of drained of any meaning, and I'm also a Swiss citizen, which is an interest because there's a democracy for you. And only this year I voted 6 times in referendums in a direct democracy. So for me, it's a whole spectrum, and democracy without, well, I'll get to that later. But my first point was actually on, you were talking about technology, and I just want to raise this because one of the things that really scared me about the US elections was when I read how in the last few weeks leading up to the elections, the stories shared on social media were mostly fake news. Those were the ones mostly shared, were pure fake news. And I've read so many interesting interviews with these 17-year-old kids in Macedonia working full-time with just making up news and spreading it. You won't believe what Hillary did. Read this story. Complete bullshit lies. And these have been shared more than real news stories in the American election. And to me, that's like, we talk about progress when it comes to technology, but what about the mirror and this echo chamber that is social media, and how do we deal with this part of technology? How do we use technology for the betterment of democracy and for people, and not just for spreading lies that lead to the rise of the likes of Trump? And the second point I wanted to raise and ask you about was, you were talking, sorry I forgot your name, the gentleman from SIM, about the conceptualization of democracy, which brings me back to the point of, for me, we've had this period now of 50 years, maybe 100, starting with, Churchill and the Cold War rhetorics from the US of this.
The first thing is, in terms of independence, was looked at as freedom, and then possibly there were not enough thinking in terms of what will be the content of the democratic project, what will be the content of the economic democracy project, what will be the content of the social relations project, or you can link it, or the cultural projects, because we are, our societies that we inherited at the end of colonialism, there are specific issues in our societies, so how do we democratize almost every level? And I think that was because the mission for most of the time, for most liberation movements really, and that kind of African nationalism was very much narrow in a sense, is let's just get freedom and thereafter we will do whatever necessary. So there was almost an opportunity gone to think about what is a post-colonial project. Is a post-colonial project just now we've got a border, this is our country now? Is a post-colonial project is now we've got sovereignty, now nobody should criticize us, we can do what we want because at least we are free? Is that a post-colonial project? Is that a democratic project? Or should we ask ourselves a couple of things? Is what is a democratic state itself? What is a democratic liberation movement, internally organizationally? What is a democratic culture if you think about culture in a traditional sense? If it's a Zulu culture, what is democratic? What are the democratic elements and what are the autocratic elements that we want to push away and so on? Or, in terms of our corporates, what is corporate democracy? And again, also on the global level, because we're in a global level, what is global democracy? Is it that the World Bank and the IMF, that all the decisions are made there by Western countries and so on? Are we as African countries and developing countries, are we participating? So in a way, I think the difficulty in embedding democracy, because there's so many spaces that we have to embed the democracy. So from the global level to the state, that we can break it, institutions, to our personal behavior, how do I engage in a relationship? Can we bring democracy in that space in our personal relations? So, it's the democratic project for me is work in progress, but how can we push it to its limits, and has it been done before in Africa, and so on. And then if one thing, just now on the post, what will happen with Trump, for example? I mean, will Trump at the head of the US, will it promote global democracy? For example, are we going to get the World Bank and IMF going to be more inclusive? Are we going to get, attempts, for example, on climate change and so on, to bring some kind of democratic accountability globally? Is there going to be advanced, going to be more democratic? And then, if we think it's not, what are we going to do? What are we going to do as individuals, as citizens, and what are we going to do as African countries? And that really it's democracy, work in progress. But how do we make, as individuals,
neoliberal democracy is anti-democratic? Certainly, I consider it as an anti-democratic element, because from the world that I come from, I mean, neoliberal democracy has got its negative effects, or has undermined the democratic development, particularly in Southern Africa. When you look at the effect of structural adjustment programs and all those liberal policies which are being proposed by the international financial institutions, because, like, if you look at when I problematize the issue of the post-colonial state, say you've got two societies living in one. We've got a dual governance system, where others are still trapped within that traditional society, and then there's modern society. And when you have these two interfacing, you end up having that, what my sister, is it from Uganda, was talking, that in the name of democracy, they'll be busy exploiting, taking the minerals, taking them out, and the elite benefits. And they benefit. If you are in Kenya, you talk of the Wabensis, because when these people, they are there through elections, and public office becomes like an exercise in scaffolding, as Breitenbach says. So access to public office means personal enrichment and personal accumulation. But this also brings in global forces, the issues of, neoliberalism and how elites. So basically for me, neoliberalism is anti-democratic. But then coming back to what we were saying, you were raising the issue of the constitution. It boils back to the issue of the citizens. To say, yes, like for example, you've got a constitution which says that there should be a devolved governance system, there should be provincial councils, and 4 years down the line, you don't have any single provincial council. And then the question is, what does that mean? Where are the citizens? Where are the leaders, civil society? So it raises a lot of all these questions. Say, democracy is not necessarily some kind of a linear project or what, but it has got many elements influencing it, and citizens do play a fundamental role. And the reason why I keep on emphasizing on citizens, because from my experience working with political parties or some of these big institutions, I found that I've got more power to influence things is from the side of being a citizen. And this is where we begin. We have to challenge the society. In as much as we want this, but what are we doing about making sure that this institution accounts or that institution accounts? Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up now. Just some concluding remarks from me. Tamuka mentioned the Africa Barometer report, where the vast majority of Africans across the continent support democracy as the preferred type of political regime. and reject authoritarianism in the form of presidential dictatorship, military rule, and one-party government. However, the type of democracy remains contested. A democratic pluralism founded on the principles of human rights that are interdependent and of equal value, albeit civil, political, economic, social, or cultural, is yet to be achieved. More than 2/3 of the continent's population are under the age of 30, yet many remain excluded from the processes that govern the political economy. On the one hand, Africa's youth bulge is viewed as a key asset to the continent's economic growth. Yet on the other, young people still bear the brunt of patriarchal and ageist governance structures that refuse to incorporate their voice. Consequently, young people have redefined traditional modes of resistance, using social media platforms as new sites of struggle. How Africa redefines itself will not only be dependent on international events, but importantly, how its citizens respond to those events. Sustaining democracies that prioritize human development of those most vulnerable on the continent will require a focused lens on the needs of the continent's youth to ensure that the vibrant and equitable democratic course is indeed achieved. Thank you so much for joining us, and do enjoy the rest of the evening.